The most destructive fire in California history is now also the deadliest. The Camp Fire is now blamed for at least 42 deaths. Firefighters are battling to protect more than 15,000 homes, businesses, and other structures just north of Sacramento.
It's one of 3 major wildfires burning in the state, and a new study finds that these types of wildfires may disproportionately impact communities of color. Ian Davies contributed to that report, and he is a master's student at the University of Washington and joins us now from Seattle. So I find this really, really fascinating. It's just another impact of these sort of fires that we don't consider.
Yep.
Ian, the study argues that while fire-prone places in the U.S. are more likely to be populated by higher-income groups, there are also thousands of low-income individuals who live in fire-prone places as well. So explain how the wildfires affect those 2 socioeconomic groups differently, despite the fact that, the devastation is pretty much the same.
Yeah, so kind of the impetus for the study was looking at Hurricane Katrina. And if you remember, Katrina disproportionately affected Black communities in New Orleans. And part of that was because they lived in low-lying areas. So when a wildfire comes through, people who don't have a college degree, they're less likely to find jobs, they're displaced. They don't have a car, they're less likely to be able to escape. And so there's a lot of different characteristics that make poor people more vulnerable to a wildfire and less likely to recover from one if it occurs.
Is insurance one of those factors as well? Are they less likely to be insured for the fire?
Yeah, poor people are less likely to be insured. So when we found that white, more affluent people were more likely to live in fire-prone places, there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly because there's more incentive to build there. If you have access to fire insurance, you're more likely to overlook the risks of living in a high fire-prone area. Wealthier people, they may have access to private firefighting response teams and things like that make them more likely to adapt from a fire if it happens.
So which minority groups in particular are especially vulnerable to these types of fires, and explain the factors that contribute to making these groups so vulnerable?
So when we actually dug down and looked at places that were really vulnerable to wildfire, we found that about 12 million people lived in areas with a significant fire risk, but also had the kind of social vulnerability that would make them more susceptible to one. And we found that Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans were significantly more likely than their white counterparts to live in these most vulnerable places. And, kind of people have asked why we chose to focus on race in this. And the reason for that is because people who share similar racial or ethnic identities have a shared history, cultural, and perceptions towards wildfire that are relevant to fire management. And there are cultural barriers in place that can affect how fire managers go to communities and help them prepare for disasters.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you're right, like context really makes a difference. And I know a lot of people will be listening to you talk and say, well, everyone knows if you live in a fire-prone area, you ought to get fire insurance, or you should prepare. It's not, these are happening every year now. So can you sort of like flesh that out a little bit? Talk about the historical significance.
Yeah, so you're right. If you live in a fire-prone place, and more people are nowadays developing in what we call the wildland-urban interface, which is these areas that butt right up against grasslands and forest lands where fires occur. And, they should be aware that fires happen. But a lot of the measures that are in place to reduce the risk of your home, like getting rid of fuel, trimming trees, putting space between your house and the forest, those take time and those take money. And low-income groups, especially people who work 2 jobs, might not necessarily have the income to be able to do that. They might not have the time to go to city council meetings or fire workshops where people are sharing this sort of information. And so outreach is really important in that regard, to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable are getting the help they need to make their homes more adaptable to wildfire.
I think it's really interesting. And, I was thinking if you're a renter as well,
right?
Maybe, you don't consider that part of your responsibility. Yeah. Maybe it's the homeowner's responsibility who, maybe you see the homeowner once a year.
So ultimately, sorry, go ahead, Ian.
Yes, definitely it's true. And if you're a low-income renter, your landlord might not be as likely to do the defenses necessary for your home. And also, if you're a renter, there's less federal aid available for you in the case of a wildfire than there is for an actual homeowner.
Also interesting.
Very.
Ian, thank you very much. The study's really fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.